Have we got rid of all confusion, Mr.
I think we're on the straight and narrow. Please maybe go to document 000425517. So, Michael, this was the document that I was going to take you to before the short adjournment. And it's a briefing, it would appear, dated the 14th of February 2020. And it's a briefing to you and Minister Swan. Yes?
That's correct, sorry.
And I think if we go down, we can see that it was a briefing for an executive meeting on the 17th of February. And perhaps you can help. Was it usual that you and the Minister would be briefed in the same way by this sort of submission for the purposes of executive committee meetings?
This wasn't a briefing for me. I wasn't attending executive meetings at this stage. This was a briefing for the Minister in advance of his attendance at the executive meeting.
So why are you one of the people to whom it's addressed rather than just a copy?
It's protocol for clearing papers that go to a Minister in terms of submission. So I would be, notwithstanding the other matters under consideration, I would have viewed the submission and approved it for the Minister's consideration.
Right, so this is an example then
Yes.
of a clearing
Yes.
process that you were involved in.
That's correct.
In order for advice to be given to Minister Swan, is that right?
That's correct.
And onwards to the executive committee,
Yes.
correct. And I think if we please go to, I'm going to try and cut through this document, but perhaps if we could go to page 5, paragraph 20. So I think this was the advice that was being provided. So we see reference there to the letter of the 6th of February that was sent to the TEO. And again, repetition of the point that multi-agency coordination is not needed yet, but they might want to consider convening a multi-agency meeting through the Civil Contingencies Group. Yes?
Yep.
And if we go on, please, to page 9. We can see that this is a speaking note and lines to take. And if we go on, please, to page 11. And if you could highlight bullet 3. And again, the same point in terms of the lines to be taken, that TEO might want to consider convening a multi-agency meeting through the Civil Contingencies Group to assess sector resilience. Yes?
Yes, and I think in the context of the first bullet point in that page, which is relevant as well.
The first bullet point.
Yeah. The final paragraph, or final sentence, sorry.
Yes. So, in terms of the message that is being provided to ministers, that might be thought of as being said with a forked tongue. So, on the one hand, clear that if we have sustained transmission and spread and a global pandemic, that the impact will be felt on the one hand. But then on the other, the continuation of the consistent message to that date that there wasn't any need to stand up civil contingencies arrangements, and rather the suggestion that they might want to consider setting up a multi-agency meeting.
This is in the context, as I've mentioned, where there have been a series of updates, 3rd, 10th, this the 17th, and then the 24th of February. So the fact that this is a regular update to the executive itself on this matter suggests a matter of some importance. I think that the final paragraph there as well, I think it is relevant in that context, notwithstanding the sentences above, that there is continues to be no room for complacency, and the Minister indicating in the final sentence there that we plan and prepare to mitigate the potential consequences. So I think that, I obviously wasn't at the meeting itself. I don't know how that was conveyed. To my reading of that, I think there was a conveying of a sense of potential significant consequences across government, and certainly potentially for health. And I think it's also important to put it in the context of the very small number of cases that this alludes to. I think the earlier page, there had been 9 cases detected in the UK. Those had all been travel related. There was no, as I recall at that stage, no community transmission that had been identified, at least in the United Kingdom. No cases in Northern Ireland, and the WHO, didn't declare the pandemic until the 11th of March. So I think it's just in that context, I think, that we need to view this at a point in time.
So I want to understand what you're saying, that's a point that obviously militates towards the suggestion that the situation isn't really, or I don't know if this is what you're suggesting, it's not gotten that serious just yet. Therefore, you might want to consider having a civil contingencies meeting, or are you saying that in fact you were trying to convey a sense of urgency and that you were trying to convey to government in Northern Ireland the gravity of the situation?
I think what was being conveyed here, that there was an urgency about planning and preparation for a range of eventualities, and I think the key is earlier in terms of the raising of the alert level from low to moderate, and governments, all governments, as was laid at the Cobra meeting, to prepare for all eventualities. So essentially what this was saying is that we just at this point in time don't know, but don't wait until we know, because we need to begin to prepare now, and health is already beginning to prepare, and all other governments under the umbrella of the civil contingency arrangement need to do likewise. So I hope that sort of answers the question. But again, I think the important point is it was in the context of what we knew at a particular point in time.
All right. Well, let's see what the messaging was that followed this. I think that the next development at this point in time was that there was a Cobra meeting on the 18th of February. And perhaps if we could just have that on screen, please. INQ 000 056 227. And perhaps if we just go to page 7 of that. And I think we can see here that Cobra was setting out planning for a reasonable worst-case scenario, the next phase. And then we can see at paragraph 18 the various points that were being set out. So in other words, it seems that the planning was starting to contemplate, for example, going beyond government and going towards the voluntary sector. Yes?
Yes, that would be my understanding of that, yes.
And I think if we go to the penultimate point at page 11, we can see as well that all departments and devolved administrations were to contribute possible future decision points to the Civil Contingencies Secretariat as part of the reasonable worst case planning. Yes?
Yes, I can see that. Yes.
So in other words, it does seem that Cobra was contemplating that the devolved administrations would become involved in terms of providing their, as it says, future decision points, correct? And what was that a reference to? What did you understand by that?
Oh, I mean, I think it's back to the earlier point, I think in this, which was a reference to the civil contingencies arrangements. I mean, I think my understanding was that that was clearly within those civil contingencies planning arrangements, and that's how that would be taken forward.
What's a possible future decision point? I appreciate you didn't write the document, but I believe in plain English. I think I've made plain many times. I've got no idea. A decision point, is it a point in time when the decision is going to be taken?
I suspect, I don't know, I'm putting an interpretation of something which But
Better idea than I have, probably.
Right, okay. Although I stand to be corrected, and as I say, I didn't write it, my sense was that this alluded to a range of eventualities should this evolve into a significant pandemic which required a response that would be a cross-government response consistent with the civil contingency arrangements. I mean, I think that's my interpretation of that. I think your specific question is, how do you know you've reached the decision point? And I think that goes back to when we have identified cases of community transmission within the UK, and if it was, as was emerging, that this was a highly transmissible virus and there was sustained person-to-person transmission, then in all likelihood we were in an entirely different scenario. But I think it probably reflects, even then, even at that time, there was a degree of uncertainty and a degree of watchful waiting, but preparing and preparedness. And you look back on it now in terms of what subsequently happened, and you do ask the question: is should we have been doing more or interpreting what we were seeing emerging more significantly? But as I say, it was based on the information we had at the time, what we knew at the time, and what our understanding was at the time.
So did you understand, I'm so sorry to interrupt, Mr. Dobbin, but did you understand future decision points to mean, so for example, when we reach 1,000 cases, we do X, or is that what you understood it to mean?
If indeed we were seeing the impact, if this became a pandemic and we started to see, or let me put it another way, if it was highly probable that this was going to become a pandemic and therefore was going to have impacts, as it did have right across government, impacts on health, education, economy, etc. So, I mean, I think that, and I can't recall clearly what my interpretation was at the time, but I mean, that was my understanding of what was meant by that.
Can I just ask you, the language you've just used of highly probable, where does that come from in terms of planning at this point?
I said if it became highly probable, I mean, I think I was just trying to illustrate the normal sequence of events where it comes for, it develops from a situation whereby there's an emerging new virus, there's an assessment of the risk, you come to a point as to whether you obviously then need to establish the likelihood that this is it or isn't it transmitting from person to person. Then the next question is there evidence that there's sustained person-to-person transmission? And then the next question is, what is the probability, likelihood that this actually may develop into a pandemic? Is that a possibility? Is it likely? Is it highly likely? Is it extremely probable? And I suppose those are the range of options which and considerations which were certainly going through my mind at the time, and certainly through CMO colleagues at the time. Obviously, we feared the worst, but weren't yet certain at that stage in terms of how things
were you develop. Planning for the worst, or were you planning for the reasonable worst case scenario as Cobra was suggesting? Well, certainly ought to be done.
And certainly in health, I know what we were doing, which was preparing for the reasonable worst case scenario, and in turn we were communicating that to other departments in terms of to use that as a basis for their planning and preparation. And there obviously comes a point, and I think this is probably an important point to observe, that sometimes it's, if you're in a major incident occurs, if there's a bomb blast, you go from being at point zero to basically standing everything up, and it's very clear that you need to stand everything up. The civil contingency arrangements, Cobra, whatever the emergency response arrangements are. However, this was a situation which was evolving and developing, and we sometimes refer to those as rising tide events. And it's sometimes not easy to determine when you're switching from one phase of the response in terms of, planning and preparing into response mode. And I think that's, we were watching this developing. We were watching the situation. We all were watching it on our televisions in terms of the situation in China, and we're going to come on to this in other European countries. Yes. But there was still, at that time, a reasonable prospect that this could have been contained in China. And as the time went on, back to John Woodhouse's email, it became clearer that was more in hope than expectation.
This was the 19th of February.
No, I know, but I'm just using, I'm just trying to relate it back in terms of, his earlier assessment. Which,
sorry, forgive me, it was the 14th of February. I'm going to come on to the 19th of February, but we're some weeks past that email where he was expressing more hope than expectation.
No, but I'm sorry, I was just referring to the use of the language. I mean, I think that's the only point I was making.
But can I come back? I don't think it matters, but what was being referred to at Cobra on behalf of Northern Ireland in relation to the reasonable worst case scenario planning was that there would be a civil contingencies group meeting on the 19th of February, which would discuss the response. And I think that's something to which you've already referred. Was that a meeting that you attended yourself?
No, I didn't attend that, no.
All right. I'm going to go very briefly to the minutes of that, if I may. That's INQ 000 023 220. The inquiry's already looked at this. It sets out the meeting, and in fact it ultimately, I think, took place on the 20th of February, although it had been referred to in Cobra as taking place on the 19th. And as we can see, the priorities that were identified in Northern Ireland were the identification of isolation facilities, legislation, storage, and then just general readiness, review business continuity plans in light of reasonable worst case parameters. And again, this suggests, doesn't it, once again, that there's no sense of urgency across government in Northern Ireland, but I mean, there's no sense of any understanding from this document if these are the priorities of the sorts of planning that one might expect to have been going on in government at this time. I
think this is a very high-level note. It doesn't reflect the totality of the discussion as I understand. And and I know you examined this, so I'm not suggesting that we pull it up again, but if we look back to the detail of the presentation by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer at that meeting, I think he was very clear in terms of planning to the reasonable worst case scenario. That would potentially mean up to 50% of the population affected, 2 to 3% mortality.
Yes.
And I think it's in that presentation where he refers to impacts across government, excess deaths, school closures, massive impact on the economy, etc., etc. So I don't think that there could have been any doubt, although I do accept this is basically a very short summary of action points and priorities. There couldn't have been any doubt in terms of the enormity of the potential consequences. And I think the other point I would make in relation to this is the reference to the legislation. We were at that time very rapidly, and indeed had just secured the agreement of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister to proceed to take forward emergency legislation in the Coronavirus Act to give us powers to implement some of the draconian restrictions that people experienced, to close schools, to ban mass gatherings, some of the other facilitating, enabling legislation to allow retired health professionals to come back, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, some of the relaxations that were put in place to reduce the burden on frontline staff. So, there can be no doubt that even taking that one example in terms of legislation, we were planning across government. I mean, justice was involved in the various clauses into the Coronavirus Act. We were involved in that. The Department of Education, in terms of school closures, was involved in that. So the seriousness, even if one looks at the powers that we were beginning to consider that were needed to respond to what lay ahead, was very significant. And similarly, the other point I would make there is the reference to excess deaths. I mean, we were talking about something that was potentially very, very significant and impactful. I absolutely accept it's not necessarily captured in those very succinct priorities, but I think it's important to understand the sort of subject matter that was being discussed at that meeting.
So why then did it continue to be the position on behalf of the Department of Health, and indeed the advice that it provided, that it was still not necessary to activate the Northern Ireland Central Crisis Management Arrangements? Because we know that was still the position and the advice being given on the 21st of February.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and obviously, and I know this has been discussed with other witnesses, and I don't wish to go through all that again unless that you wish, but I think that at all times it was seeking to ensure a proportionate response to this. I mean, it's quite clear that, and certainly the last reference point there in terms of readiness, in terms of business continuity plans, that was a big ask of departments to ensure that their business continuity plans were in place. There was also a request, and we referred to this, and this was referred to in the presentation by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, about engaging with their sectoral partners, their ALBs, to ensure readiness. I think that there is that point, and it's where you switch from preparing to responding. And I think that whilst civil contingencies arrangements are primarily geared to responding, that is not at the exclusion of standing them up in the preparedness phase, particularly if standing them up in that preparedness phase can add benefit in terms of greater cross-government coordination. So I think the point I'm making there is I think it was a fine judgment call as to whether they were stood up at that point in time or not, because in standing them up, you then move into a situation where you're having daily meetings of CCGNI. You have the daily situation reports from each department. That is a huge, huge commitment and undertaking. And I suppose the question was that time better spent in engaging with the respective sectors, ensuring business continuity plans were placed, doing the advanced preparation, or would it have been better spent with finite resources standing up CCGNI? Now, I think these are judgment calls, and I think that had this been a tripping of a switch in terms of a major incident, it would have been straightforward. I think the difficulty thing, this was something that was emerging, evolving, and developing. And I think it takes judgment then to determine when you switch from one into the other, recognising that there are significant resourcing implications which may detract from the initial preparatory work. I mean, I think that's the only point I would make.
Do you accept that at this point in time it ought to have been made lucidly clear to government in Northern Ireland about the gravity of the situation that it faced?
I would contend that it had been made clear, and I'm surprised if it wasn't understood. Particularly given the briefings that the Minister was providing to the Executive, as I said earlier, throughout February on a weekly basis, the engagement that had been with other departments, the memo that had gone from the Director of Population Health you alluded to earlier, the briefing that had been provided to PermSec colleagues by the then PermSec department. I think that we were there in a situation where, and I think this is important context, we were in a situation where the WHO had already declared that this was a public health emergency of international concern. Cobra had been stood up. Now, Cobra doesn't get stood up because of something that can be necessarily managed within one department. there were regular meetings of Cobra. As I say, we were in attendance, TO officials were in attendance at official meetings of Cobra. Papers were being circulated. And, you know, in that time, all of us, you know, you turn on your television and we could see what was happening tragically and unfolding in China and elsewhere. So,
Professor, I'm going. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I'm going to try and move this on a bit. But I mean, I assume that you accept. We might all, and officials might have been able to watch this on the television, but you are the Chief Medical Officer to Northern Ireland, and one might expect you to have been the person giving the sort of clarion call that that matters really had reached a point of some significance.
You know, I was fulfilling that role within the department. I was directing and leading the departmental response, coordinating the planning preparation for the public health response, the health service response. I'm briefing the minister, supporting the minister at Cobra meetings. I think it's not an unreasonable expectation that senior officials and other departments would brief their own ministers. You know, I hadn't yet been invited to attend or update the executive or the First Minister or Deputy First Minister. And, you know, had I been afforded that opportunity, I would have updated the executive consistent with the updates that were being provided to the minister to bring to the executive meeting.
All right, I'm going to move on then. There was the 13th SAGE meeting took place on the 5th of March, and I think because the Department of Health in Northern Ireland provided us with a list of dates that you attended it yesterday, that in fact we know that you did attend that meeting. And I won't go to the document, but at page 3 and it's point 7 of the notes, SAGE said that Her Majesty's Government should plan for the introduction of behavioural and social interventions within 1 to 2 weeks to contain and delay spread. Precise timings depend on the progress of the epidemic. So I assume if you attended that meeting, you were aware that that was the advice that SAGE was then providing. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's correct, yeah.
And I think it was that, wasn't it, that then led to the Cabinet Secretary emailing across government and the devolved nations about moving to the next phase and seeking an assessment of each department's preparedness against the reasonable worst-case scenario. Yes?
That's correct, is my recollection, yes.
And if we could go to that document, please, at INQ 000-309 229, please. And I think we have to start at page 9. So I think we can see from this, Sir Michael, that this email, and forgive me, we've come straight onto the second page of it, but it was sent from Cabinet Office to numerous people across government and across the devolved administrations. And if we go to page 9, please. We can see that it was a commission, impacts of non-pharmaceutical interventions, by 1 p.m. on Saturday the 7th of March. We can see, please could all departments provide a return by Saturday the 7th of March. And if we just scroll down a little, please. The measures that were being contemplated are the 3 set out. And if we just go down, thank you. If we scroll down a little bit, please. It also asked, are there specific implications for policy areas in the devolved administrations? And that's just the penultimate point. Correct? And I think that we can see, if we go to page 6. Yes, thank you. We can see that the email that came from Mr. Stewart again to a number of, I think that's permanent secretaries, to Dr. Chadha, who I think was your deputy.
That's correct, yes.
And to other people in the TEO, brace yourself, and setting out what had been requested from the Cabinet Office, requesting information. And I think we've already seen this, and I'm sure you're familiar with it at page 5. The Education Permanent Secretary set out that he thought he would have difficulties in replying to this.
Yeah, so the first paragraph, yes, I see that.
And at page 3, you replied. And we can see that, so 7th of March, obviously in the early hours of the morning,
Yeah.
where you set out that Northern Ireland simply didn't have modelling capability to replicate and provide such granularity. Then we can see that given the unrealistic timeframes, it's not possible to provide any meaningful analysis. That you were unclear as to why this was a must-do. That it was a marathon and not a sprint. I can just pause there. It was a sprint by this stage, wasn't it? I mean, there really was. The reason why government departments and devolved administrations were being asked to respond at such short notice was because of the urgency of the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think all I would add is that my concern was what we could reasonably provide that was meaningful, as the PermSec and Education said, within that time frame that was actually going to be of material use. And you're correct. I mean, it was a sprint, but then also my team had been sprinting for 7 weeks at that stage and working flat out, working 16, 18 hours a day. And there's a question of reasonableness of asks given the time frame for the return. Now, as I recall this email, because I do remember it, it was an email that I picked up, as you say, late in the into the early hours. Prior to that, I had phoned when I received it the head of the EOC, the Emergency Operations Centre, asked that she check with what Wales and Scotland were doing with the request, because it was a pretty generic request. She contacted me again at 12:30 to basically say that she was working with colleagues in those jurisdictions who equally weren't certain in terms of whether they could provide anything of any value, and also whether that would be materially different in terms of the mitigations. You know, are there particular characteristics that would be different in the population in the respective jurisdictions, as I recall. Now, this is for an official meeting of Cobra on the Saturday, as I recall, hence the return by lunchtime, but the actual ministerial meeting wasn't until the Monday, and we worked Saturday and Sunday and did make the return on the Monday in advance of the Cobra meeting. So I think all I would say is that I think irrespective of what is in the content of this, we responded to the request and worked throughout the weekend to ensure we got the return back.
I'm just going to carry on with this because, in fact, we have later emails that I think show that, in fact, Cabinet Office chased up and pushed for a return to be provided.
Well, that might be the case, but as I say, we were already working on the response. But
so, and just before this goes down, we can see it's the third paragraph up.
Sure. That
there is deeply troubling and significant community transmission in the Republic of Ireland, which might be without other risk of wider community spread. We are some weeks behind. Yes?
That's correct.
So, and we can see there, you weren't saying we might, give us a day or whatever. You were saying, I suggest that we wait further modelling by SAGE, in which I participate.
Well, just to add that we did actually get that further return from SAGE, and I mean, it's not in this series of emails, that's in my evidence bundle, but I think around 8 o'clock, it may have been that evening, we did get additional material from SAGE and from DHSC to inform our population of this return. So I hadn't seen that at the time, but I have subsequently become aware of that. So my assumption that we would get further information was a correct assumption.
I'm just going to ask before, I've got some questions to ask about this, but just before the document goes down, I think if we could look, please, at page 4. And I think, I think this is the final part of the same message that we saw at the top. And what you say at the first paragraph is our priority across government is to ensure that we remain focused on our priorities at this time, while still in the containment phase, recognising that other parts of the UK are in a different place and preparing for surge with plans to mitigate impacts on public services and wider society. And then again, in weeks, we'll be in the same place. We have, however, some time, not a great deal, to fully and accurately consider and quantify the implications and any unique impacts in Northern Ireland, as opposed to responding to unrealistic deadlines and providing less than fully informed analysis and information. And then again, reference at the third paragraph to there being a soft stand-up of civil contingencies arrangements. And I think before we leave this, we also see the reference, because I do want to pick this up, about Italy. And then I think your professional advice in respect of that. And if I just deal with that before we go on to the next email, my professional advice will be in the context of the UK position that the responsibility for authoritative competent advice on the safety of travel remains with the FCO, which has UK-wide responsibility to provide advice other than this has significant financial implications. And then you go on to say that you do recognise the complexity and incongruity of current advice to schools in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So just picking up on that point, that's because school trips were still going on to Italy. And I think concerns had been raised in Northern Ireland that was still the position, given that I think Italy was in fact in a lockdown at this stage.
Certainly significant parts of it. I mean, but 12.5 million people in Northern Italy, I think at this time, were already in lockdown, and there was a period of significant inconsistency, as pointed out in that section, between the advice that the Irish government were providing in terms of not travelling to Italy, and the Foreign Commonwealth Office, who provide and are responsible for providing travel advice. And obviously in Northern Ireland, that's particularly problematic, as you can imagine.
So just going up, please, if we can, to page 2 to finish off on this document. So this is, and I'm looking at the mid-email from Chris Stewart. To be aware of Michael McBride's advice, which means that the analysis put to the Cobra meeting on Monday will not include specific Northern Ireland material, hence no specific briefing from me. You will also sense Michael's irritation and caution at the prospect of departing from FCO advice. It might be prudent to advise the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister to soft-pedal any raising of differences between the UK and Irish advice. And I think if we could go to page 1, please. And again, it's an email from Mr. Stewart, and it starts Carol. I think, is Miss Morrow from the...
She's from the Executive Office, yes.
Thank you. Even that needs caution. I think that related again to the position with Italy, lest the Deputy First Minister might appear to be at odds with or ahead of her CMO. So just going back then in terms of all of those emails, I mean, what it suggests, again, is that you were inserting yourself into communications from the Cabinet Office to the Executive Office and effectively telling the Executive Office that it ought not to be responding to correspondence from the Cabinet Office that it had been asked for in terms.
I mean, that's not my interpretation of it. I think certainly what I was clearly saying, that I felt that it was extremely challenging and difficult to provide anything meaningful within that time frame, and I stand by that. We did, however, do the work, and we did provide the response, and that was in advance of the reminder from the Cabinet offices. Indeed, we did participate in the Cobra officials' call on the Sunday, where this matter was discussed, and the Cabinet office was informed that we were preparing the information that had been requested. As I say, I wasn't copied into this chain of emails, and I wasn't aware that the request had been stood down because obviously this was more than health. There was a request in relation to education, and had I been copied in, I would have said, look, we are working on developing the information, which we did do over the weekend, and did make the return and did participate in the Cobra meeting. I'll maybe pause there on that specific issue, but I know there's other matters in the email you want to cover.
Well, the position about Italy was obviously quite serious, wasn't it? Because there was obviously awareness, and in fact, I think Mr. Baker, who was the permanent secretary in the education department, I think had raised concerns about this idea that children were going to Italy. And what that email suggests was that even the Deputy First Minister was being, or was expected to hold a line so as not to depart from the position that you had taken, rather than it being the other way round.
No, I mean, I don't agree with that characterisation. I simply, had I been asked as Chief Medical Officer, what is your professional advice to the public, professional medical advice, I would have advised them not to travel to Italy. But that wasn't the request. The request here was in relation to the advice by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in relation to whether it's safe to travel. Now, those are matters that were within the competence of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. As Chief Medical Officer, I don't advise on that. It primarily relates to the ability, and particularly why the schools were concerned about this. One, they were concerned about the safety of their children, and indeed whether the children should be travelling, and indeed their staff. But there was also a secondary issue, which was about insurance and compensation for not travelling and cancelled trips. And I think that's why it was also a material issue for schools, and why I agree there was at that time a mismatch between the advice that I would have provided, which I refer to in terms of professional advice, and the position of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which at that time was basically still saying it's safe to travel. And I think all I was saying was it's not for me to intervene and insert myself into the advice that's been provided by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. That is not my role.
But you're the Chief Medical Officer. No. Your role is to provide independent advice, and that advice can be contrary. If it's independent, it can obviously
be
contrary.
But I have no role or influence to the advice or decisions of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I mean, I think that is the point. That all I was simply pointing out is I can provide, as Chief Medical Officer, professional public health advice. Is it wise to travel? No, it is not. That is very, very different from the advice from a government department, which has responsibility to advise the public in relation to countries that are safe to travel to, whether it's in the context of conflict or whether it's in the context of a health threat. That is not within my role and responsibility. So those are two distinctly different things.
Did you give that advice then, in terms of your professional advice, that there shouldn't be travel to Northern Italy?
I honestly can't now recall, but I've no doubt that, it refers to explaining at a meeting, I presume, I don't know what date was this, the 7th of March. That was the, I can't now recall whether, but I think that was the point I was making. There's a distinction between official government advice around travel, which is FCO, or their counterpart in the Republic of Ireland. It's a very different matter in relation to professional health advice that I would be providing. If schools were to cancel, let me take this further forward. If schools were to cancel school trips on the basis of my advice, they would not be able to claim insurance or compensation for those cancelled trips. And I think that was why, and undoubtedly that was entirely appropriate in those circumstances for the Deputy First Minister to point out that incongruity, that how can it be, given the developing and emerging situation in Italy, that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, at odds with the advice from the Republic of Ireland, is advising its citizens not to travel. And I think that was a very legitimate point to make, but it was not an issue which I could insert myself into and resolve.
I'm going to move on to a different topic, if I may, Sir Michael, because I'm conscious that time is pressing on. The issue of large-scale events has arisen, I think, in every devolved administration. And I just want to understand the point. I think you have set out in your witness statement issues around ensuring that there were powers, and indeed you've just mentioned them, powers to cancel large-scale events. But it's right, isn't it, that by the 10th of March in Northern Ireland, a number of large-scale events had been cancelled, and I think this includes the St Patrick's Day parades in Belfast, Newry, Downpatrick, Derry, London, Derry City and Strabane Council, and the Royal Economic Society's annual conference. 600 delegates had been cancelled, and I think tickets for a football match against Northern Ireland and Bosnia-Herzegovina had also, ticket sales had been cancelled. Yeah. And all of those events were cancelled, I think, because the organisers decided that they wouldn't go ahead. So if Northern Ireland was spared the consequences of super spreader events, it was because of the acuity of the people who organised them, rather than because of any advice that had been given not to hold them.
Well, there are 2 points there. Firstly, you referred to super spreader events. I think that outdoor events in general are safer than indoor events, and it is a matter of fact, evidentially, that most transmission happened in the home or in enclosed spaces. So the general rule is outdoor spaces, and indeed even outdoor interaction, was always safer throughout the pandemic. Of course, that became clearer as our knowledge grew, and you're correct that there was not absolute certainty at that point in time. But I think that we need to go back to what SAGE was advising at that time. The advice from SAGE, and again I've covered this in my witness statement, was that they did not see that mass events would make a significant contribution to the transmission of the virus at that time. That was their assessment. There was also the other very material and real concern that if mass events were cancelled, particularly those events that were scheduled to be outdoors, that people would respond in a way that they would come together indoors to mark those same events, and perhaps in indoor environments where there was less ventilation and there was closer contact. I think that, so the SAGE advice at that time, and I remember those discussions at the SAGE meeting, was that cancelling mass gatherings was one of the least effective interventions. And you mentioned earlier in the email about the number of social distancing measures that were being considered, that cancelling of mass gatherings was one of the singular least effective interventions. I think, as I've also mentioned in my statement, there is the wider point, which is that the fact that these events occurred created a sense of normality when there should be no sense of normality. So I think that looking back on it now, there was probably not a full appreciation, even in the discussions at SAGE, about how that might influence public behaviour. And I think it's fair to say there wasn't a full understanding of the fact it wasn't the events themselves, but actually the interaction and the intermixing that goes on pre-events, post-events, travel to events and public transport, etc., all of which created environment. But to say at all times, my advice, I did not at any time depart from the scientific advice, and I was very mindful of that. I provided the advice, and ministers made decisions. I do recall in those in the run-up to those events that at the request of Minister Hargey, I did engage with a number of local councils and met with them who were considering cancelling their events, and that was the advice that I provided, i.e. the evidence is weak around this at this point in time, and the scientific
I'm going to move on, but
okay.
I think the bottom line is, Sir Michael, that Northern Ireland was probably fortunate that the organisers of these events decided to cancel them themselves without waiting for any advice from government or any rules
I mean, if I might respectfully suggest, I think that's a conclusion to which we don't have the evidence base. I mean, I think that the evidence base that we have now is that mass events did not make such a significant contribution. It's actually as I mentioned, the mixing pre and post event and transport too. So, I think that's a conclusion which wasn't, it's easy to make that now. Was all I would say. That is not the scientific advice that was available to us at the time.
I'm going to move on to a message I think that you received on the 23rd of June. If I could go to this is INQ 000370538, and it's at page 6. Thank you. I think that these are messages between you and the Chief Scientific Advisor. And I'm just looking at the message. I think it's about 6 down. It's a message of the 23rd of June 2020. And you say, Ian, would you be free for a short call in the morning? Edwin Putz connected with me, I assume that is this evening. Peter Corrie drive-in concert wants to allow eating beside car, 2 metre space, all on the same left side of vehicle. I've asked for details, re-numbers and toilets and cleaning, etc. So I think what this would tend to suggest was that Mr. Putz was contacting you on the 23rd of June about having or knowing someone that wanted to have a concert.
Yes.
And
yes.
Eating beside it. I mean, was that usual that ministers would contact you directly in order to see whether or not they could be allowed or whether these sorts of events could happen?
It was an unusual approach. It wasn't a typical approach. I mean, undoubtedly, ministers would have made contact about certain aspects during the pandemic. I think this
seems to be about allowing some sort of large scale. It doesn't appear to be maybe a private gathering, or this looks as though it's a sort of substantial undertaking.
Well, I think
that a minister's asking you.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly what I was referring, and you can see, I referred, and if you go down through this, we referred to the legislation. So essentially what I was referring to there was, is this permissible in the context of the legislation? I mean, I think there was a lot of pressure at that time, because this was early June, and the executive had just agreed indicative dates for a series of relaxations because of the levels of transmission were low at that time. I don't recall the exact legislative position, but I think irrespective of the approach, as you can see from the responses and the exchange between Ian and I, we were basically affirming we needed to check. We weren't saying, let's make a special case or allowance for this. We were saying, what does the legislation say? So I think it was not unusual for us to, I think looking back on this, not this particular episode, there's more general points that at times, and we did produce from early June onwards, as I recall, guidance to the public about what the legislation meant for them and their everyday life, because it was often, I think, the public found it difficult.
I'm going to I hope you don't mind.
No, that's okay.
I am going to cut across you because time is pressing on.
Okay.
And this is not guidance to the public at large. This is something very different. And I think if we look at what the Chief Scientific Advisor replied, sounds okay on its own, but would undoubtedly give rise to lots of other requests, might also require a change in legislation. I mean, you're there to give Your role is to give medical advice. Are you suggesting that you're giving legal advice?
No. I mean, what I'm suggesting, the bottom, the very final in that chain, the legislative position, I'm basically asking policy colleagues to check what the legislation is. It's not for me to interpret legislation, change legislation. I can provide advice in terms of where I think the balance of risk is in terms of relaxation of restrictions, which is what I did. But I think what I was double checking was what was the legislative position vis-a-vis restrictions at that time. Was this permissible within the legislation and the restrictions that were then in place? I think the final text message signals that.
Would you not have said, I'm terribly sorry, it's not my job to give that sort of advice to ministers? You should look at the regulations yourself or take advice from someone who's...
I mean, there's always a balance in these matters in terms of, relationships with ministers, which are important, and particularly at a very difficult and challenging time. And obviously, Minister Poots had previously been Health Minister, and I'd worked closely with him. And he obviously had my number from that time. So, I mean, I agree that it's unusual. I could have said, sorry, I can't discuss this with you. Get one of your officials to check the regulation. But of course, one of his officials wouldn't necessarily be in a position to check the regulations because he wasn't in the relevant department at the time. So, I mean, I accept the point. And, essentially what I was trying to route this back is to the legislation and an interpretation of what the legislation actually said.
I'm going to move on to a different topic, which is the closure of schools. The inquiry's heard a lot of evidence that the Republic of Ireland moved to close its schools on the 11th of March. I'm going to bring up a document very briefly that the inquiry's seen before, which is INQ 000 232 525. And we can see it's dated the 12th of March. And if we go over the page, please. Yes. The meeting started. You weren't in the initial group of people, but the meeting started, and then we can see that you arrived with the Health Minister, Mr. Pengelly. And we can see that the First Minister said that there was an urgent need to decide on action in Northern Ireland. And this is where we see Minister Swan saying that containment measures are working in Northern Ireland, that following the Republic of Ireland position would crash the NHS and create unnecessary panic and fear. Complexities included grandparents being in a more vulnerable group and therefore not able to look after children at school. And then we see Minister Swan referring to the need to follow the science. Closing schools will not stop the spread of COVID. Republic of Ireland approach not appropriate for Northern Ireland. So I think it's clear that that was the advice and presumably your opinion at the time, correct?
I mean, I think the balance of the advice, I mean, I think that's the Minister is here talking about the immediate closure of schools and his concern around the consequences in terms of the health service, but there was a wider context which he and I discussed, which he would have been aware of, around the relative contribution of schools being open to transmission and the damage that it would do to children if schools closed. And I'm happy to elaborate on that if it's helpful.
I think that's understood. I think it's just understanding the chain of events and why that advice changed. Because the inquiry has seen that there was an executive committee meeting on the 16th of March.
Yeah.
And again, the issue of whether or not schools should close came, there was a vote on that.
Yes.
And the Health Minister did not support the closure of schools. And presumably that was on your advice, correct?
Yes, and I think I've covered that extensively in both of my statements. I think up until that point and at the meeting, it may have been either the 12th or 13th of March, there was a series of interventions, and we alluded to this earlier in the Cabinet Office request. to look at a variety of social interventions. It had modelled and made an assessment of the impact that school closures would have on reducing the peak of infection. And its conclusion on the 12th of March was that it may reduce pressures on the health service by about 20 to 30%, but on its own, it was one of the most least effective interventions on its own. Now, I think that at that time, what I was weighing up on my mind, and that was based on an assumption and the presumption that the transmission of schools was similar in children as seasonal influenza, which in actual fact it turned out not to be. And you mentioned about super spreaders, that children can act as super spreaders for flu. So managing the situation in relation to schools open or closed was one of the most challenging issues during the pandemic, because undoubtedly schools being opened did push up rates of transmission. How much we didn't know. But what we did absolutely know is closing schools is damaging to children from an educational point of view, in terms of their social development, in terms of their mental and physical health, their life opportunities, and really important in terms of addressing health inequalities, which we discussed earlier. So those were not easy decisions, and the advice from SAGE at that time, the resolved advice at that time was, yes, closure of schools may play a part, but not now. And that was discussed and agreed at Cobra on the 12th of March, but maybe later. But if you are going to have to if you do decide, ministers, to close them, you're going to have to close them for a minimum of 12 weeks. So I was, at that point in time, not satisfied that the evidence base around transmission, the benefits in terms of reducing community transmission, outweighed the significant evidence that we had of damage to children.
Yes.
And that's particularly a case in point in relation to children with learning disability, special needs, which I also flagged at that time.
So on the 16th of March, schools should not close. 18th of March, schools should close.
Yeah.
So what changed?
When you referred earlier to the meeting of the 13th of March, which was the SAGE meeting, which was a really important meeting, it was signalled, I think, at the meeting of the 10th, and then I think it was the 13th of March, my dates may not be correct, that we were actually further into the pandemic than we realised.
But this was, you were,
no,
the 16th of March was the date that the meeting...
No, but this is really important context. In the run-up to that meeting of the 16th, SAGE realised that because of data capturing issues and very limited community testing, we were actually further along into the pandemic than we'd actually realised. What was also increasingly apparent at that time, that there were huge pressures in the health service, and particularly in London, and the health service and intensive care beds were about to be overwhelmed. So several things happened at that point. We realised we were further into the pandemic than we knew because we weren't testing enough, because we hadn't got the capacity. That caused significant concern. At the meeting of SAGE on the 16th of March, there was an agreement that they would remodel the impact of schools, having previously said, don't close schools, not yet. And on the 18th of March, the SAGE meeting, and the recommendation was close schools as soon as possible. So that reflects the speed with which the change in decision happened, and I reflected in that in the advice I provided.
All right, I'm going to ask if we could look at a document, please. INQ 000 371 378, and I think we have to start at page 4, please. So yes, it's the message of the 17th of March 2020. This is from Minister Swan to you. He has wind that the Scots are going to move independently and that Gavin Williams is going to make a similar proposal to Boris on Easter. I think this relates to Easter holidays in schools and potentially bringing them forward. Is that right?
Yeah.
And ground is already being laid. And if we look at the next message, You say, I won't read all of it out, but one can see that you mentioned trailing this with CMO colleagues earlier in the week today. Then you say, I'm afraid they don't quite get it. Everyone wants to take the lead now. Suggest you and the executive do and steal a march, if any planning to do so prior to Thursday, from advice. And then reference to the sort of statement that might be made. And then if we go about 5 lines up from the bottom of this paragraph, this will now be a political rush to declare first, and Nicola will want to lead the way. Is that reference to Miss Sturgeon?
Yes.
Not optimistic on UK consensus on timing, and perhaps in discussion, I think that's reference to Lord Weir, Baroness Foster and Miss O'Neill. We should steal a march and declare our intent. School closures are inevitable. We might as well be on the right side, given that we have held the line at cost. And I think that's probably supposed to be a reference to Nicola May seize the moment. And then a bit further down, it's at 2349. You say, Minister, I've now departed from the realms of professional evidence-based advice. To you anticipating further sage evidence, I'm confident they'll recommend school closures, although probably not prior to Easter. You and ministerial colleagues have held the UK line at cost in support of me. I need to now recognise the political reality and confusing public narrative. The experience of my CMO colleagues is just not there. And then I think if we just go down a little bit more, please, to 2359. And then I think reference to whether or not it should be announced at the committee. Just to be aware, I've not discussed with Richard, so it might be best if this is a political proposal when we meet tomorrow. And then pending this, suggest you take a tactical view from Richard, as in my experience, he is good at such things and may proffer some useful considerations for you as Minister. Again, Sir Michael, this might be seen as a significant move away from the provision of medical advice to a minister and quite firmly entering the political realm.
I think my concern at that stage is reflected in those exchanges. I think we were losing the public narrative. I think there was a great source of public debate about this. I think that was covered extensively in the media. I was under very significant pressure to change my advice, one way or the other. It was an impossible position for me to find myself. I consistently kept the position in terms of the scientific advice that was provided by SAGE in terms of the impact on transmission, the harm that would be caused to children, and I did not want schools to close any earlier than was absolutely necessary. I accept the point. My concern is that this was becoming a public confidence issue at a very early stage in the pandemic.
You're advising your minister about Miss Sturgeon possibly stealing a march on a political announcement. That is not medical advice, is it?
No, but I think where it is material is in terms of wider public confidence. I think the one thing that it was important, particularly at that early stage of the pandemic, was that we were getting consistent messages out to the public in terms of what we were asking them to do to minimise their risk. We were about to ask people to do almost unthinkable things, but with unthinkable consequences in terms of their everyday life. And this was a clear fracture point, and was a particularly clear fracture point in Northern Ireland, where you had decisions that had been implemented in the Republic of Ireland, which hadn't been implemented in Northern Ireland, and there was a huge amount of debate and public concern, and parents were voting with their feet at that time in terms of some parents were taking children out of school. There was, in my view, we risked then losing the consistent messaging, and I think that equally would have applied across the UK, and that's why it was hugely important. We eventually did get to a UK-wide agreed position, but I was really concerned that it was all going to unravel really, really early on.
Those were all points that had been made on the 16th of March. The point about parents already taking their children out of school, That was a point that was already being made on behalf of, or being made by some ministers.
Yeah.
What shifted was the political landscape.
Well, there were two things were shifting at that stage, and I alluded to one a short time ago, which was the decision by SAGE to look again at the modelling of the impact of school closures. I mean, that decision was made on the 16th. And I can't recall the time frame between the executive meeting on the 16th and SAGE meeting, but SAGE said, as I say, on the 10th or 13th, we're further into this than we think we were. We're going to have to look to additional measures. As you recall, on the 16th, the advice to all households to isolate if someone in the household had symptoms. So my sense, although I didn't yet know what the outcome of the SAGE modelling was, but my sense was that we were in a rapidly escalating situation, and my sense was that the SAGE advice, as I've alluded to there, was that the advice would change and they would recommend school closures, which in actual fact they did on the 18th of March. So I think that's the context. And I was really anxious, I have to say, that we would lose the public when public trust and public confidence, I knew, was going to be absolutely crucial over the next period. And I accept the point you're making in terms of I've strained beyond providing professional technical advice, yes.
At the outset of your evidence, I asked you about your independence from government, and I asked you about the concept that the independence of the CMO is a prized characteristic of the office. It's very clear, isn't it, from the examples that we've seen, that your role wasn't one of independence, and that you did on occasions veer not just into directing or involving yourself in the work of the executive office, but we've seen here an example of something that's really overtly political.
I genuinely do not accept the characterisation about inserting myself into the role of the executive office, and I feel I've adequately and fully addressed that and answered that. I think how others have interpreted my response, a response which I wasn't copied into, is another matter. I think in this case, I wouldn't underestimate the pressures that I was experiencing at that time to change my view, change my professional advice, and all I was doing was providing professional advice. But I was increasingly aware and anxious that my professional advice had become a dividing line within the executive, rightly or wrongly. And you alluded to the executive meeting of the 16th of March, where there was a vote taken whether to follow my advice or not follow my advice, which was a nigh on impossible position for me and to place me in my view. And what I was trying to do was to ensure that at a very early stage in this pandemic, with all that was ahead of us, that we continue to maintain the trust and confidence of the public, which I think that is a genuine responsibility of mine in terms of my role in public messaging. I have a material role in public messaging, which I filled throughout the pandemic. And I was really, really concerned how this was playing out in the media at the time and creating confusion in the minds of the public. And I was genuinely concerned about the longer-term implications of that, because I knew that we had many, many more difficult asks of the public in the months ahead.
My lady, I think that's probably an
Certainly.
appropriate time for a break.
I shall return at 3:15. Struggling.
Thank you, my lady. So, Michael, I just wanted to, as it were, round up on this period of time.
Sure.
I think that the national lockdown was announced on the 23rd of March, 2020. And I don't think I need to take you to this, but in your statement, I think you suggest that that was something that you discussed with the other UK chief medical officers on the 23rd of March. Is that correct?
It was a busy day, the 23rd of March, but yes, that's my recollection.
But I think it's right that you hadn't given any advice prior to that
That's
to
correct.
the executive committee that a lockdown that you advised that a lockdown was necessary at that stage. It was the UK government who effectively
That's
came to
my
that.
recollection. I can expand if it's helpful, but in the interest of time, maybe it's not necessary.
In terms of why you didn't think one was...
Well, I mean, I think we
that.
collectively, we met on the 16th of March, and in the days in the run-up to the 23rd, we certainly had noticed an impact of the measures that had been announced on the 16th.
Yes.
But I think we collectively agreed that we needed to go further. Now, we did not have discussions about lockdown, but we felt that more was needed. And then we did meet again on the morning of the 23rd. There was a CH meeting, and then there was the Cobra meeting later in the day. So it's hard now to piece it all together, but things were moving very, very quickly then. And I think we acknowledged that there needed to be more intervention.
And in terms of, and again, I'm just rounding up on this stage of the pandemic, do you agree that Northern Ireland was perhaps fortunate compared to other parts of the United Kingdom, and particularly, I think, London and the south of England, that that lockdown was announced by the UK government whilst the pandemic was still not as at an advanced stage in Northern Ireland?
I think, relatively speaking, although we didn't know, I mean, I think that part of the problem was, when this information came from CH, we're further into this. We didn't yet at that time know how far in we were because we weren't testing enough. But I agree, we did benefit in that it was introduced at a relatively earlier time in Northern Ireland than certainly in parts of the UK, certainly than in London.
In terms of what explains then the lower mortality rate in Northern Ireland during the first wave, do you attribute it to that rather than anything else that might be different about Northern Ireland or that might provide another or contribute, as it were, to the fact that there was a lower mortality rate?
I mean, I don't want to be seen not to answer the question. I think it was an important contributory factor, but there are other factors which I think we need to factor in terms of issues in relation to population density, deprivation, etc. And obviously there is the risk. We did have benefits in the initial lockdown, and particularly removing people who were at risk. But obviously then you have more people who hadn't developed natural immunity through exposure, and I think that partly explained why we had a more challenging second wave. So unfortunately, pandemics work that way, that the way out of it is hopefully through immunity, through vaccination. And the difficulty is the timing of those measures, because if they're too early, you get all the harms with none of the benefits, and if they're too late, well, they're too late and you're overwhelmed. So they were just a finely balanced decision. But I agree we did benefit. I think the reasons why we benefited are most probably related directly to the timing, but there may have been other factors.
All right. I want to move on then to just ask you a bit more about the challenges that you faced in your role, or perhaps the factors that made your role more complex as the pandemic developed after the first wave. And the first thing that I wanted to ask you about was the funeral that took place on the 30th of June 2020, which was attended by the Deputy First Minister and I think 2 other ministers. Can you provide your view or opinion as to what impact that might have had at the time in terms of, or if it did in any way complicate or make more complex either the position in Northern Ireland or the position within government?
I suppose I'm not in a position to give any objective assessment of the impact that it had. I think my concern at the time, and there were other high-profile breaches of the guidance and the regulations at that time right across the UK, was that anything whereby those of us in a position of public profile and who were leading response to the pandemic or contributing to leading the response, anything which suggested that there was one rule for us and a different rule for someone else, I think was extremely problematic. My concern was that and the other incidents where this occurred created a great deal of hurt, anger, and also had the potential to undermine public confidence in what we were asking people to do, and the huge sacrifices that people had already made at a time where they had many, many more sacrifices to make. So I was concerned about the discordance of those images, and indeed other high-profile individuals across the UK who had similarly not followed the advice, which was there for everyone and there for everyone to follow.
All right. I wanted to ask you then about how the pandemic developed in late summer and into the autumn of 2020. And I'm going to try and do this without reference to documents, just because time is against us. But I hope these are just uncontroversial dates or general propositions. I think that it's right that Northern Ireland initially had quite a decent period where transmission of the virus actually became very low indeed.
Yes.
I think that was probably around the maybe end of June, start of July.
That's correct, yes.
But that then quite quickly rates began to go up.
Yeah.
And I think, first of all, it's right that you had advised ministers at quite an early stage that once restrictions were lifted, that would be quite a likely outcome. Forgive me if I've put it if it wasn't put as high as that, but certainly I think you advised.
I mean, my advice was that it was inevitable. I mean, we had a population that we estimated less than 5% had any immunity to this. We had no vaccine. It was highly transmissible. It is the nature of pandemics that they are either growing or shrinking, and you only shrink them by reducing, sadly, the mixing of people and networks. And once you remove those restrictions, it comes back. It doesn't go away. It was inevitable, and I think everyone understood that to be the case.
All right. But I think the reality obviously was that the restrictions had to be lifted.
They did.
And I think that you advised a calibrated approach to the lifting of restrictions that effectively allowed for restrictions to be lifted sequentially, but allowed time to monitor the impact of lifting one before another was lifted. Is that broadly correct?
That is absolutely correct, and that was in keeping with SAGE's advice at the time as well. Yeah.
And in terms of what was initially driving the uptick in transmission in July 2020, I think it's also correct that it was primarily amongst younger people who were initially contracting the virus to begin with. Is that also right? Yes,
young people mix more. At that stage, they'd already made huge sacrifices in terms of their education, schooling, university. So inexorably then, once you get it rise in younger people, it makes its way into older people, and therein was the risk.
Yes, and I think that it took a little while for that to become the position, and that older people started to get infected. But I think, nonetheless, the advice that was given by the chief medical officers of all of the United Kingdom was that schools should reopen, and they did reopen in Northern Ireland, obviously with safeguards such as they could be in place as well.
Yeah, we issued a 4 UK CMO letter because we felt it was so important that parents understood that it was better for children to be in school. Teachers were confident that it was safe for them to be in school, and that we were really, really concerned about all the evidence that showed real harm to children from not being in school. So, yes, we wanted children back in school, and that certainly was a priority for the executive as well.
But I think very quickly then you also had to grapple with the reality of the transmission rates, I think, starting to go more seriously up in September, and that led to the advice that there should be localised restrictions. I think they initially took effect on the 11th of September in Northern Ireland.
Around the 10th, and then we tightened them further, extended them further to Northern Ireland wide on the 22nd. But before that, I provided advice on the 18th, as I recall, that the executive should begin to consider either local restrictions or Northern Ireland-wide restrictions. And the executive proposed, and the executive had agreed to, even in, I think it was late August, or around the 20th of August, to reduce the number of people who were meeting in a household and in private gardens, etc.
So that was the rule of 6 that came in.
We never actually used the term in Northern Ireland, but it was a term used in England, but it was the same approach, basically.
And I think it's right schools reopened, I think we've already seen this, so I won't take you to it, but that you and the Chief Scientific Advisor also give advice about opening pubs that didn't serve food, and that was something that was of particular concern to you. I think we've already seen that the advice said it may not be possible to have schools open and pubs, these sorts of pubs open at the same time. But I think it's right that pubs did reopen at a point in time in September as well. I think that was on the 23rd of September.
I think it was around that time, yes.
And again, I'm not going to go to the documents about this because we've seen it before, but on the 21st of September, SAGE gave advice because rates were rising across the United Kingdom. And I think SAGE provided a menu of options.
They did indeed, yes.
That were available. And I think it's also correct, in fact, that that was reflected in a paper that went to the Executive Committee on the 24th of September.
That's correct,
which I think also set out those options to them. I think it's also correct if we move sort of past that point, and I think when it became clear that those localised restrictions hadn't been as effective as had been hoped, that you and the Chief Scientific Advisor were advocating a more robust intervention at that point. Is that right?
That is
I think
correct.
that's in and around the 5th of October.
It was around that 5th and certainly over that, the next few days, yes, and over that weekend.
And I think that also coincided perhaps, and I won't take you to this, but one can say it in some of the messages, perhaps between you and the CSA, and there's one that talks about, for example, that you and he both felt that you were being briefed against in the media by ministers. Do you...
Well, I don't think we said ministers. I think.
Sorry,
in fairness, I think what was happening at that stage was, and I think it's been covered by the inquiry already, what was undermining decision making, in my view, at the executive, and undermining the advice that we were providing was the almost in real time leaking of evidence into the media. I mean, you would be sitting in at times in executive meetings, and the media would be reporting on something that had just been said in the executive. Now that created a huge sense at times of distrust, and in my view, significantly impeded the timeliness of decisions. The media coverage of that became a distraction. I mean, ministers should be afforded the opportunity to discuss such important matters which impact on lives and livelihoods confidentially, to robustly challenge the advice that they're providing, as is in their right, to ensure that they make the best situation or the best decision they can, because there were no easy answers here. There were just a series of bad outcomes, and some were worse than others. So it was deeply, deeply undermining, and I think we experienced that as well as ministers.
Yes, and we know, and again I won't go to this, but on the 8th of October there was an executive committee meeting, and we have already seen that it was a meeting that you said that you had never been more concerned. I think at that point in the course of the pandemic than you had been at that point. Is that correct?
That's correct.
One of the ministers who gave evidence in the course of last week suggested that you had come to the meeting with that level of concern but hadn't offered any recommendations to the meeting. And I wondered if in fact that was correct, or whether or not the previous recommendations that had been made or the advice that had been given was still extant at that time.
I'm not sure the particular time period that we're referencing there, but...
This was on the 8th of October, so I think it was Minister Hargey, and I will be corrected if it...
Well, I mean, I think that we presented the situation to ministers and our concern, and I think, as I recall, we had a series of meetings, I think one on the 11th, I think which might have been a Saturday or Sunday, to brief the First Minister and Deputy First Minister further. And as I recall, then there was an executive meeting either the 11th or 13th. So we were outlining the position. We were saying we're in a very difficult position. This is what we foresee the consequences might be in terms of pressures on the hospital system, very near to being overwhelmed. The consequences of the high levels of transmission, not just on hospitals, but when you have high levels of community transmission, you also have high levels of outbreaks in care homes. So we were clearly signalling the need for us to bring a further paper with our advice to ensure that there was an executive decision making. So I think the paper of that period of the 5th was more a discussion paper of, look, this is the situation, and we need to think of what the options are. That's my recollection, but I would need to see the paper.
Okay. I don't think we need worry about that, because I think matters moved apace.
They did.
And that you did, in fact, recommend, or you and the CSA, I think, jointly recommended that there be a 6-week period.
That's correct.
Of restrictions. But at that, we've already seen this again, and I won't take you to it, but in fact, the Executive Committee didn't accept that and instead enacted a 4-week period of restrictions.
Well, I mean, our advice is advice. I mean, they certainly considered it, but again, ministers at all times were weighing up not just the health and scientific advice, but the impacts on society and economy and a range of other things. So, I know the words did not accept. I mean, I think that it's up to ministers as to how they use the advice. And I'm sorry, I'm dancing on the head of a pin about the use of the word accept. But I mean, we provided the advice and ministers made a decision.
Yes, and they didn't take it. And I think we've seen there was a 4-week period of restrictions which then fell to, would have lapsed,
yes,
I think on Friday the 12th of November. Yes. And that precipitated the meetings about which the inquiry has heard quite a lot,
yes,
that ran over the period of the 9th, 10th, 11th
yes,
and 12th of November. And I think that you were obviously at that meeting, or well, if it can be characterised as one meeting, but I think it's clear certainly from the messages that you sent in and around this time that it was an extremely difficult meeting, and that tensions at it were extremely high.
That's correct, yeah.
And in fact, what you went on to say, certainly on the 10th of November, I won't bring it up on screen, but you said that it was disgraceful and that they should all hang their heads in shame in respect of the ministers. Is that right?
I mean, I think the second part of that WhatsApp is the relevant bit, which is putting it in the context of the consequences, which I was reflecting on a 46 or 49-year-old man saying goodbye to his children on
yes,
FaceTime. So, I mean, I think...
Take your time, someone.
Yes. And
my sense was the need to understand the consequences of decisions.
Yes. So that people understand what it is that you're referring to. What you had said in your message was, how will history tell this story to the wife and 2 boys of a 49-year-old who said goodbye to their father on Facebook on Friday?
Yeah.
So I think what you were reflecting there was obviously the reality of the position that some people were in hospital in Northern Ireland. All right, well, I think we can see that was obviously a very difficult meeting for you. And I think that it's right that in terms of what happened after that, was that certainly when it came to the next meeting, when the decision had to be made about what to do,
yes,
that in fact Minister Swan didn't feel that he could make any recommendations to the Executive Committee for fear of how.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the Minister will speak to this. My assessment of it, which I've covered in my statement, was that, and the Minister alluded to this, and it's in the paper, that he regretted the fact that his paper had divided the Executive, and I know, I mean, and the one thing I would say is throughout that period, the First Minister and Deputy First Minister were working very hard to achieve consensus. That proved very difficult, and I think the Minister's approach was to present a series of options to ministers, so that ministers felt that there were options available to them and that there could be a consensus on a way through. So there were a series, as I remember the paper clearly, from A to H, about different approaches as to how we might prevent the health service being overwhelmed, prevent and reduce the risk in care homes, etc., etc. And those were outlined, but there was no recommendation in the paper.
Yes, and I think it's quite difficult to work out the chronology because obviously there were those restrictions did lapse. It appears that there was a period of about a week from the 23rd of November onwards when shops were open, and I think cafes were allowed to open as well.
There was, yes.
And we've seen then, I think, that one of the consequences of that, certainly that the Chief Scientific Advisor pointed to in his papers, was that even a short window at that time, again, did cause an impact again on transmission rates.
It did. I mean, things were on, I think we said this at the time, were on a knife edge, and we had a good impact from the 4 weeks, but it wasn't enough, and admissions were still at very high level. ICU admissions were high. Health services was running very hot. A lot of sick people in hospital. Similarly, numbers of outbreaks in care homes, and we needed more. And we did. The executive did agree to a further 2 weeks. There was some amendments. Then there was a proposal to classify toy shops as essential retail and click and collect to open. And what we did see when we look back on that, I think it's reflected in a later executive paper, was that the first week we got a good impact, and mobility figures in terms of population movement were down, and the second week less so. But nonetheless, and I know we've shared this with the inquiry, the overall package of measures that the executive put in place at that time compared extremely favourably with other parts of the UK and were more effective by comparison to the measures in Scotland, Wales, or in England, and as assessed by SAGE. So, yes, it was a very difficult period, as the population experienced.
And I think we saw with Sir Brandon Lewis that certainly in terms of the impact on on healthcare workers in Northern Ireland and health services, that military aid was required in order to compensate for some gaps in staff.
Staff in hospitals and care homes were burnt out at that stage. My own daughter was working in intensive care as an anaesthetist. So friends and family working in the health service and colleagues, it was an extremely difficult time.
All right, and I think that then we're obviously into the decision-making that took place around Christmas as well, which was obviously pressing at that point in time, and there were difficulties, I think, in trying to arrive at arrangements, and I think those changed as well. But ultimately the position was arrived at that people would be allowed to meet for a short period over the Christmas holiday.
Yeah, I mean, people had been eventually locked down for about 40 weeks at that stage. We were hugely concerned about the damage in terms of mental health and well-being. People hadn't been able to visit their elderly relatives. They hadn't been able to visit their elderly relatives in care homes. There was genuine concern at that stage about the impact. And again, Minister Long, I think, mentioned at one of the executive meetings around the 8th of October that her view was the public were beginning to lose hope. And I think that was the case. There was a sense of no way out of this. So I think it was a very difficult time, undoubtedly for the population, everyone working in the health service. And I think there was a general sense, is there going to ever be an end to this?
One of the things that I wanted to ask you, if I may, about that period as well, and again, I won't go back over the meeting minutes, but there may have been a sense on the part of some at the executive committee meetings, and possibly a concern shared by you, that there wasn't sufficiently robust policing at that time.
Yeah.
Is that right? Or certainly, am I correct that there was a concern about that?
I think that was a concern probably from August and probably even earlier from the easement of restrictions. And I was fully supportive of the 4E approach of, engage, inform, educate, I think it is the third, and then enforce. And I worked very closely with the then Assistant Chief Constable Alan Todd. We had regular calls. I think it was a very difficult ask for the PSNI on top of other competing demands. And I think we all knew that, we couldn't, we couldn't police this virus into submission. And I think that, the important part of the police's role was their role, in my view, in engaging and explaining enforcement where there are egregious breaches, which there were in some instances, and fines were issued. But I think it was just about encouraging the public and reminding the public. And I think, by and large, my assessment was the police did a very good job in very challenging circumstances.
So, Michael, can I ask about the regulations? Did you ever discuss, I don't know if you know, but in Module 2, I saw some of the regulations, certainly ones drafted for England. And having done nearly 50 years in the criminal justice system, I couldn't have enforced them. So did you have that problem here?
We did indeed, and the PSNI and raised on a number of occasions that they found them at times impenetrable.
Yeah.
And the fact that they kept changing. We were reviewing the regulations initially every 3 weeks, then every 4 weeks. We reviewed them 5 times in wave 1, 8 times in wave 2, 10 times in wave 3. So they kept changing, and indeed it was even difficult for the public to keep up with what we were advising them to. So I've absolutely every sympathy with the police's position. I'm absolutely not an expert in the regulation at all, or the regulations, but I can only but be sympathetic how difficult and challenging it was for them. And of course, the executive recognised that, and the police were not the only organisation responsible for enforcement of regulations. The executive did provide funding to local government to appoint COVID marshals, and indeed local councils played a significant role in encouraging their own communities to abide by the guidance and follow the regulation. But it was, I think at times the PSNI were placed in a nigh on impossible position.
All right. I'm going to move on, if I may, to a different topic completely, which is the Republic of Ireland.
Sure.
And cooperation with the Republic of Ireland as part of the response. The inquiry has seen a paper that was prepared by the Civil Contingencies Group in the Executive Office that was, I think, provided in and around maybe the 20th of February. And one of the things that it said needed to be considered was civil contingency arrangements in relation to the Republic of Ireland. And I think as well, you also, certainly at the outset of the pandemic, I think possibly in a WhatsApp or an email exchange with the other UK CMOs, had said that modelling with the Republic of Ireland would be very useful. And that was right at the outset. And I suppose the question is really this, whether or not you do consider that cooperation with the Republic of Ireland worked in a way that was optimal perhaps to both jurisdictions during the pandemic, or whether you consider that perhaps more could have been done.
I think certainly at the professional level and policy level, we had long established very close working relationships. I mean, Tony Hulin, who's the Chief Medical Officer of the Republic of Ireland, the first contact we had, I think, was on the 22nd of January, and then again a phone call on the 24th, and we were, in very regular contact throughout, and we set up the regular meetings then following the signing of the MOU in May, as I recall. I do not think that professional cooperation could have been any better. Similarly, working with CMO colleagues across the UK. I think there were some challenges as well, and I think it's only fair to say, and particularly around international travel and border and sharing of information. Now, we worked through those public health agencies, professional to professional, and found workarounds. But in terms of the passenger locator forms, we ran into all sorts of, and apologies, all sorts of legislative barriers about why information couldn't be shared for public health purposes because it related to enforcement. And respective attorney generals got involved, etc., from memory. But we did get there, and we did develop a workaround. So it wasn't without its challenges. And during that time, ministers, through a series of North-South meetings or Quad meetings involving the Secretary of State, met on a very, very regular basis.
So you seem, I think from your answer, perhaps you don't think there was a deficit or that any further structures are required in order to, if there were to be another pandemic, that might make cross-border.
No, I wouldn't say that. And I think I did say, Chair, in Module 1, that I think for the future what we need is a two-island, five-nation approach. This sense that somehow or other that a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland insulates approaches to how you respond to a pandemic is not based on any epidemiological basis. The island of Ireland, behaved like a single epidemiological unit, although there was variation at time. The transmission rates in Dublin were not necessarily the same as in Belfast, and we often had hotspots in border areas. So the trajectory of the pandemic in Northern Ireland was more similar to the Republic of Ireland than it was to the rest of the UK. But borders are controlled. Just one example, borders are national. So that would have required the UK government and the Irish government to work collaboratively, and particularly material implications for the common travel area, for instance. So, and you referred to civil contingencies earlier. In my view, there needs to be very close interconnection between civil contingency planning on these islands, full stop. And I would also argue that pandemics spread, and with global travel, we need to also think about our connectiveness to Europe. And I think we just need to be more expansive in terms of our learning from this pandemic. Trying to control the pandemic in the UK, in Northern Ireland, or in the Republic of Ireland does not work. It has to be a global response, and it needs to be certainly within our gift, in my view, coordinated across the common travel area.
May I just ask you on the subject of borders and the idea that the reality that there were hotspots on the border, was there any particular reason for that, or is it just to do with the specific locations or density of population, or because people travelled backwards and forwards?
Well, I suppose border issues are the same, wherever you look. In Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, you go over a bridge and you're in one country and then in another country. These populations are seamless. A farmer has a field in one jurisdiction and he takes his cows into a field in another jurisdiction. These communities are very close. Many of them go to school. Back to the earlier discussion, many of them go to schools which are in respective jurisdictions. So, those same issues pertain to parts of the UK, obviously between Scotland and England, and between England and Wales. But I think that we did see particular hotspots in Derry and Strabane and Donegal, for instance. We never quite understood why that was. At times, the feeling was it was transmission from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland. At times, we thought it was the other way around. And I think then when there was different restrictions, north and south, so the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland decides to open pubs and restaurants, the population travels across a 200-mile, very porous border, and that is a significant factor. So it was a challenge, and I think it does speak to the need for greater policy alignment where that's possible, whilst absolutely respecting that there are two sovereign governments, the Irish government, the British UK government, and there are executives and assemblies in the other nations, and I don't know the political answer to that. That's a question for someone else.
Okay. Thank you. My lady, I'm conscious that there are questions for Sir Michael, and I was going to, if I may, pause there. Oh, I think I've got a little bit more time than I thought. I'm just conscious that I think I do have 10 more minutes. Okay, that's fine. I do have 10 more minutes. So, Michael, I'm going to try and deal with one topic then, and I'm going to try. I'll try my best not to deal with this in too superficial a manner, and you must stop me if I'm
Sure.
if I take this at too fast a pace. But it relates to the position in respect of care homes in Northern Ireland. And we did touch upon this with Mr. Pengelly, and I think understand something of the basic chronology in terms of what happened in care homes.
Yeah.
And I think what we have seen is some communications that took place. For example, we see it in March that there was a letter from Mr. Pengelly to the Chief Executive of Arm's Length Bodies. And in the Department of Health summary, Covid-19 plan from, I think it was mid-March to mid-April, the advice or guidance given that trusts will work to maximise and utilise all spare capacity in residential nursing and domiciliary home care. So I think reflecting the advice at that time, and we've seen other iterations of this as well in the way that it was put, that effectively I think the idea was that people should be moved from hospital where possible to live in care homes in order to provide space in hospitals. So, I mean, first of all, that it is right, isn't it, that that was the policy that was initially adopted at the outset of the pandemic?
I mean, I think the letter, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it actually indicates, where it's clinically appropriate. I mean, there was never a policy direction to the health service to discharge people from hospital. I mean, and it was made clear at all times that the decision to discharge an individual patient is a clinical one for the clinical team. We historically have a problem which is common across the UK of delayed discharges because of the inadequacies at time, and it's not solely this, but of the adult social care system. That's not a reflection of those working in it. It's simply a reflection of the resourcing and funding over quite a considerable period of time. And I think what the letter was indicating, I think appropriately, was the concern that there would be a significant number of people requiring hospital care and that we wouldn't be able to manage that demand, and indicating that trusts need to do everything they could to make sure when it was clinically appropriate to ensure the discharge of patients from hospital, whether to home or elsewhere. I think that's how I would present it, but I do accept it can be interpreted in a different way.
I mean, regardless of how it's interpreted, I think the issue that arises is the testing of people before they were discharged from hospital into care homes. I think from the face of the documents we've seen, and I'm thinking there's an email about this on the 18th of April that is then reflected in policy advice on the 19th of April.
That's correct, yes.
I think that, and again, this was following what was happening in England, and it was only then that it was said that all discharges to care homes, and so I put this properly, that all individuals who were discharged from care homes should be tested for COVID-19. And as the inquiry understands the position, it's really around the 19th of April that becomes the policy guidance that testing should take place.
I mean, I think if we look back on this, an important learning point in all of this is the severe limitations that we had in testing capacity. There were many things that we would have wanted to do in terms of testing that we just didn't have the tests to do. We did prioritise tests for those in care homes and in adult social care, and also for vaccines later on. We just didn't have the testing capacity. I think that there is a wider, and this is a really important contextual piece, which is the best way to protect the vulnerable and protect those in care homes is to drive down community transmission. All of the evidence and all of the peer-reviewed evidence suggest that the correlation is between community transmission and outbreaks in care home. And, we can bring up the INQ if it would be helpful, but the evidence would suggest that the most significant indicator of care home outbreaks is the size of the care home, which is a proxy measure for footfall. So the most important thing you can do in a pandemic such as COVID is to reduce, tragically and sadly, with all the consequences, reduce the footfall into care homes, and that's other professionals coming in to make assessments. It's also sadly and tragically the consequences of the restrictions that were placed on visiting. It's also in terms of ensuring that you don't have inspectors moving from home to home, and that actually if you correct for care home size, that the contribution of discharge from hospitals, the evidence would show, made a very small contribution. The reason I only make that point is not to defend testing or not testing, but I think that in terms of learning for the future, we really do need to understand what the drivers of infection were in care homes. The most important thing when to protect vulnerable individuals in care homes is the effectiveness of infection prevention control, which is difficult in a care home because you've got staff who are providing close personal care with the activities, supporting the activities of daily life. So the infection prevention control arrangements are crucially important. And yes, testing of both staff and patients, whether they come in from the community or from hospitals, are also an important part of that. But had we done nothing else and tested people coming into care homes, sadly and tragically, that would not have prevented the huge consequences that we saw in terms of deaths in care homes. And I think I make that point only to say that there is important learning in the experience in care homes, and it would be evidentially in the evidence there's no basis for saying that it was solely due to people being discharged from hospitals. Undoubtedly that did make a contribution, but it wasn't the major factor.
I think another factor must have been the lack of routine testing in care homes for a very considerable period of time.
Well, I think that the testing in healthcare, social care staff working in care homes were prioritised for testing, and from the very first, the second version of the interim testing protocol from the 28th of March. And, I think we all would have wished to have increased testing in care homes, both in terms of people, where a care home is their home, and in staff working in care homes, and people coming in from care homes and coming out of hospital. We didn't have the testing capacity, and it was only also the other point was that our knowledge and awareness of the risks, particularly of asymptomatic infection, which we discussed earlier, became clearer. So we went to extensive efforts. I'll not rehearse this, and it's covered in my statement. The Minister was very clear of the priority he afforded to the testing in care homes, and very clear in his direction to us to roll that out as quickly as we could, and we did. Do I wish we could have rolled it out quicker? Of course I do.
Because I think it's right, and forgive me if I have the chronology wrong, that I think it was by the 12th of April, there was testing of all symptomatic residents where a care home reported 2 or more symptoms.
Sorry, would you run the date past me again? Sorry.
12th of April.
I think it was before that, actually. I think from the 24th of March, we were testing up to 5 individuals, and then we would say, this is an outbreak. When what we did in the early days was we used the approach that we would use for seasonal flu. So if we had an outbreak in a care home, and people were symptomatic, we would test up to 5 individuals, and then we would isolate those individuals, and that was the public health approach and evidence base at that time. From the 12th of April, from memory, we then began testing all symptomatic patients in care homes, and then from the 24th of April, we started testing all symptomatic people living in care home and staff, and then we started the rollout of the testing program in care homes that didn't have outbreaks, from memory, on the 11th of May, and the Minister announced it on the 18th of May. And then we had the rolling programme of regular testing, which began on the 3rd of August. So we ramped it up as quickly as we could. But, I mean, I think, maybe just to illustrate the point, on the 19th of March, we had a testing capacity in Northern Ireland of 200 tests. That was all that was available to us. At the end of April, we had a testing capacity of, as I recall, 1,600 tests through a lot of hard work and scale up. But the Pillar 2, which was the national testing programme, we had something like 300 available to us. So, I think if there's anything that needs to come out of the inquiry is the importance of actually having diagnostic capacity and the ability to ramp that up very quickly once you've identified what the next novel virus is and how we're going to test for that.
Because I think it's right that it wasn't until the 3rd of August that there was regular testing of people that lived in care homes every 14 days.
No, we didn't. The answer, two parts to that. We did start the rolling programme of testing from the 11th of May, as I've said. And, sorry, maybe I've misunderstood. What was the
regular testing, so periodic testing of people that lived in care homes every 14 days was the 3rd of August.
Prior to that, as I said, in May, we started testing and a rolling programme, and the Minister announced that on the 18th, and we said that we would complete testing in all care homes that had previously had outbreaks. We completed that programme, as I recall, on the 28th of June, and then we announced we continued to test, but you're correct that the rolling programme commenced on 3rd of August, and we were only able to do that then because we could use the national testing capacity. And we didn't test every 2 weeks residents because we did, at the time, you mentioned earlier about the level of transmission, we altered that depending on the levels of transmission. So initially, as I recall, we were testing staff every 2 weeks and residents every month because, if you're an 80-year-old or an 85-year-old in a care home, you remember those swabs in the early days were very unpleasant. They had, you had a swab from the back of your throat, you had a swab up both nostrils. And there were many people living in care homes who were confused or had dementia, and we were genuinely concerned about some of the implications of that. So we did increase the testing of both, as I recall, staff and residents, depending on the level of community transmission, which was driving the infections in care homes.
Well, Lady, I'm conscious that corporate.
Afraid you probably now have run out.
Yes.
Sorry.
Great.
Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, Lady, and thank you, Sir Michael. Sir Michael, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID bereaved families for justice in Northern Ireland. I have 3 topics and 10 minutes, so forgive me if we take them at something of a canter. But I want to return, please, to the end of January 2020, and perhaps we can put back on screen the Professor Woolhouse exchange, which is at INQ 0000475559. Thank you. And the second page, please. I want to look at this from a slightly different perspective, Sir Michael. Firstly, you're very familiar with the content of Professor Woolhouse's email.
Yes.
And we know that in the body of his email, he refers to the WHO numbers in terms of the reproductive rate and the case fatality rate. He refers to having, if one was to put those numbers into an epidemiological model for Scotland, they would have grim predictions. And then he reinforces that, in fact, that's not a worst-case scenario, but just building on, essentially, the WHO's central estimates and currently available evidence presents a reasonably grim picture. And you know that, and I see that you're nodding. Firstly about this, and it's a very brief point, I hope, there wasn't anyone at this stage putting such numbers into an epidemiological model for Northern Ireland, was there?
Not at that stage, in that we didn't... sorry, the answer to your question is no, we weren't doing it at that stage. We were using in early February, we were using the estimates from reasonable worst case scenario for pandemic flu, and indeed, as we alluded to earlier, we did provide that estimate. I think it was early February. We did that, I think, about the 5th or 6th of February. So we were doing the same sorts of estimates, but that was based on the reasonable worst case flu scenario, which we had agreed as UK CMOs was a reasonable point to start planning from until we got hard data about COVID.
I mean, we know at this stage that Professor Young was still in post, and we know from your earlier evidence that you didn't approach him in terms of any assistance that he could offer within that time frame, and indeed before he left for his period of leave in mid-February. Yeah. But if we can please scroll up to the first page of this email exchange. Because in a response essentially to the same email chain, we can see at the top that Chris, and we understand that to be Professor Sir Chris Whitty, was asked against a tight timeline for his view in terms of evacuation of UK citizens from Wuhan. And his advice is underneath where the name has been redacted. And he says, I think there are two reasons we should be considering evacuating people who are older or have pre-existing health conditions from Wuhan and the surrounding area if they request it. And he goes on setting out for essentially reasons for that. But at point A, this seems to be the group most affected by the novel coronavirus. And it's very difficult to determine the level of risk, as inevitably the data coming out is going to be behind the reality. So these joint emails, if we put them together and combine them, firstly, present a very clear statistical warning in terms of the epidemiological statistics that Professor Woolhouse had identified. And secondly, in terms of Professor Sir Chris Whitty's response, it identified that there were particular categories of people that needed, even at that early stage, to be prioritised. And those were older people and those with pre-existing health conditions. Isn't that right?
I mean, I have a view of joining those two together because I don't think that's I think we're conflating two separate issues. But I'm happy to answer the question if there's a question there.
Well, certainly the statistics that Professor Woolhouse had indicated were worrying. Whether or not they were entirely reliable, certainly they were alarming. And secondly, and whether it's connected or not, certainly in this email, categories of people who were particularly vulnerable had been identified. As priority by Professor Sir Chris Whitty.
On the Professor Woolhouse's email, that was not informed by any hard data that we had about how COVID would behave. And I think that's an important point.
Well, it is one that I think you made, in fact, in evidence earlier today.
Yeah, so it was not based because unfortunately we did not have hard data that would inform the various calculations that you would need to make in terms of what the impact would be. So we were largely modelling at that time, such as it was based on very, very wide confidence intervals.
Sir Michael, so I don't want to stop you, but in fact her ladyship has heard the evidence in Module 1 and Module 2 in relation to that as well. I think the point that I do want to focus on is that statistics being reliable or not are certainly subject to interpretation. Sure. There were categories of people who one needed to be particularly concerned of from the outset.
I think this is a really, really important point because what we again, on terms of clinical vulnerability, and I've covered this extensively in my statements, that it was very difficult to ascertain and compare one healthcare system and the impact that this novel virus was having in a healthcare system compared to a UK healthcare system. And there are two really important factors there because the demographics of the population are different. And the other factor is the health service provision is different. So a novel virus like this could have a very different impact in China, given population density, given the health service as it was, as compared to the demographics of a UK population, depending on its age characteristics, social deprivation, etc., and the health service. What this was relating to was an observation that, insofar as we could see, that it was older people in China and with those with long-term conditions, pre-existing health conditions, that were suffering serious disease. That didn't necessarily translate. And again, I have covered this in my statement. We were not yet certain or sure at all whether that would translate into a UK scenario.
When did it become obvious to you, Sir Michael, that older people and those with pre-existing health conditions should be prioritised?
We really had we had emerging data globally, but the first hard data that we had in terms of how this would behave in the UK was when we had UK cases. And again, as I've covered in my statement, we had an approach where we examined in detail the first few hundred cases, which was to identify those individuals who were hospitalised with severe disease, those that ended up. So it was really, to answer your question, it was not until we had experience of the disease in the UK that we were able to say definitively these are the individuals who are at risk.
If I understand you correctly, you were not able to say definitively until presumably some point in mid-March, is that right? That older
that's
people
correct.
were particularly vulnerable.
We could see what was happening in other countries.
Yes.
And so, there was an awareness of a level of risk, yes.
Well, given the awareness of the risk, a level of risk, and the Chair has heard evidence both in this module and in other modules that there was an awareness that a problem would come when the virus hit hospitals and care homes. At what point did you, in your role as CMO within the Department of Health, direct that there should be particular consideration given to priority groups in preparation for the oncoming pandemic, and those priority groups being older people and those who are vulnerable?
Well, certainly I worked with the professional colleagues and policy teams leading in this area, so my team worked very closely with them. So we had the Director of Older People Services and the Chief Social Worker who was leading on this work with support from one of my DCMOs. And we took a number of steps. In terms, we've already alluded to the guidance that was issued. The first guidance that went out to care home sector, and then
I'm going to stop you there, because if that is
February.
Yes. We know that there was guidance that went out, and in fact, the guidance that we have looked at, or at least been referred to in the course of this module, in relation to care homes, was developed in and around the 16th of March and distributed on the 17th of March. And we've heard evidence from Mr. Lynch, the Commissioner for Older People, about his involvement in that. Would it be right to say that it really was not until that period of mid-March when there was active consideration given to what was going to happen when this virus hit care homes?
Again, I was trying to point out there, the first guidance that went out to care homes was from the Chief Professional Officers in the department and the Chief Social Worker, and his director was on the 27th of February. So it was at the end of February as opposed to the middle of March, and there was updated guidance then in around the 12th or 13th of March. I think that was largely, the early documents were based on Public Health England's assessment of risk around prevention, what to do if someone develops symptoms, around isolation. The first very detailed guidance, as you correctly point out, went out on the 17th of March, and then there were further iterations of that.
Can I ask you, did you contribute to that guidance?
I didn't personally contribute to that, but my Deputy Chief Medical Officer, who I mentioned earlier, has a public health consultant, extensive background in public health, did actively contribute to it.
Did you contribute to the Department of Health strategy in relation to, and I know you said it wasn't a policy as such, but in terms of discharging patients from hospital in order to free up spaces? Is that something that you...
No, I didn't. I didn't contribute to that. I didn't provide professional advice into that. And it wasn't because that wasn't in a very important area. There were policy colleagues working on that. They were also accessing the best available advice from the Public Health England, who have experts in this area, and which we couldn't replicate. They were also working very closely with the Public Health Agency, and as I say, on all aspects of this. But I personally, due to other commitments, wasn't contributing to that. No.
I want to ask you about a letter that you wrote on the 20th of March, and it's INQ 103688. I anticipate it's one that you'll be familiar with. It's the letter that you wrote to RQIA instructing it to cease all non-statutory inspections of care homes. And just to put this into context, we know that at around this time, care home guidance had gone out on the 17th of March. Many care homes, if not all, had in fact stopped visiting in order to protect their residents. We know that there was going to be, if it hadn't started already, a significant discharge of people from hospitals into care homes in order to clear space in hospitals. And we know that many of the people whom I'm representing from then or thereabouts onwards were denied access to their loved ones, and the eyes and ears on the ground were withdrawn. Did you consider, when you instructed RQIA to cease all non-statutory inspections of care homes, that that would essentially withdraw eyes and ears from what was happening in care homes at that particularly vulnerable time?
Just to provide clarity, the letter addresses two things. Firstly, it basically says to RQIA, you do not continue with your non-statutory inspections. Inspections in care homes are statutory inspections. So essentially what we were giving RQA here was regulatory flexibility. The inspectorial function within RQA during the 13 weeks when they were given that flexibility did not cease, did not stop. Basically what we were asking them to do and directing them to do was to use an evidence-based, risk-based approach in terms of their inspection. So they did, and over that period, from memory, conduct 61 inspections. 51 of them were face-to-face, involving visits to care homes. Some of them were remote, others were hybrid. In terms of the eyes and ears, at that time, RQIA was redirected its resources to develop a home support team, which was in daily contact with care homes. They developed an app and subsequently a web portal where they were assessing and get. No, I think it's really important.
It is important.
No, it is important
there is
because
in fact going to be another module on this and enlightening.
No, but I think this is an important point. If you wouldn't mind, I'll finish it very briefly. There were more eyes and ears in care homes in terms of RQIA. That home support team had 3,500 calls. They were professionals providing advice to care homes during the first wave. In the weekend of Easter, there were 400 direct calls into care homes to check in, and those assessments that the department was receiving through professional colleagues within Chief Social Services Officer looks at occupancy outbreaks, whether they had sufficient PPE and any testing. So
yes.
I think the point about not having eyes and ears, combined with the fact that in the first wave there were 23,000 hours of nursing time from trusts supporting care homes, I think it's just important that we have a rounded picture. Whether that was enough, I think it's another matter.
Well, it's a matter for another module, in fact.
Yes.
I'm going to move on and deal with it very briefly, coordination with the Republic of Ireland. And I want to talk about, in particular, the Memorandum of Understanding, and we can put it up if we may. It's INQ 000130355. The Memorandum of Understanding, as we understand it, was developed after a meeting that had happened on the 14th of March with senior ministers from Northern Ireland, with counterparts including Leo Varadkar and Simon Coveney from the south, and yourself and Dr. Holohan were both present at the time. Okay. And there was in that meeting on the 14th March a desire expressed for joint messaging, a desire expressed for working together. And as a result of that, the Memorandum of Understanding, and we can see, in fact, at paragraph 1.2 and 1.3, is in part the outcome. Now, if we go down, and again, just very quickly through it, paragraph 4.2, 4.3, we'll see some of the issues that were the subject of it. So public health and non-pharmaceutical measures is one heading, and I'm only going to look at headings. 4.3, common public messages. 4.4, behavioural change. And over the page, please, to paragraph 6. Paragraph 5 we can see is regular engagement, but paragraph 6 in particular, thank you, is that given that the response to Covid-19 requires a whole government approach, participants will provide an agreed regular update to our respective administrations. And then if we can go to the last page, please. We can see the box for signatories, and it is signed or was to be signed by yourself and the Chief Medical Officer for the Republic. Did you in fact sign it off as a final MOU?
My recollection, it was signed off as a final document, yes.
Given the topics within it, I mean, things like non-pharmaceutical interventions, communications, behavioural change are not exclusively the remit, if you like, of the Chief Medical Officer, but do stray into policy and, in fact, do stray into politics when it comes to communications. Was consideration given to having this signed off at a higher level?
I think that the outworkings of this, Tony Houlihan, or Dr. Houlihan and myself were supported by respective policy teams. So following the signing of this, I think our first regular meeting, formal meeting, was on the 14th of May. So we would have had the respective policy teams from the Republic of Ireland and
by higher level, in fact, I'm thinking of the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister, the Taoiseach,
sure,
perhaps even the Secretary of State, in order to generate that two-island, five-nation interest.
I was going to come on to that because I thought the first part of your question was about, was it appropriate in terms of the policy issues that were within that. So I think in terms of the policy issues, I think that format was entirely appropriate because we had the support of policy colleagues. You're absolutely right. This is not a substitute for political engagement and discourse. And the work that we were doing under the aegis of the MOU did certainly inform our respective updates to meetings of the North-South Ministerial Council. I did support the Minister, Deputy First Minister and First Minister at Quad meetings, which involved the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, and at times, and also the Secretary of State. So those regular political engagements and discussions were ongoing. And certainly when we had the North-South Ministerial meetings, the Chief Medical Officer in the Republic of Ireland, my counterpart, and I would have provided updates in relation to work that we were separately doing, but of also areas of collaboration.
Sir Michael, final topic, and I know I'm pushing it, my lady. You were asked earlier in your evidence about an email exchange between you and Bernie Rooney in relation to a submission that she had provided to the Executive Office on to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister on the 30th of January. Bernie Rooney is we know, a senior civil servant who at the time was a Deputy Director of the Executive Office, who reported to Chris Stewart, who in turn reported directly to the head of the Civil Service. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I was.
At the time? Okay. Ms Rooney has provided a statement to the inquiry, and I wonder if we can have a look at it. INQ 000468508, and it's page 11. And at this part of her statement, she addresses this exchange with you, and it's that I would like your assistance on.
Okay, just to clarify, this isn't in my evidence proposals, and I don't think I've read this statement, but I'm happy to try and answer questions as best I can.
And I don't want to be unfair to you in any way, and if we need to do it in a different way, no doubt we can. Can we zoom in, please, paragraph 46 to, there we go. This is just to indicate that she had sent the submission, which had been requested and approved by her manager, to the First and Deputy First Minister on that date. And can we go to the next paragraph, please? That evening, she received a telephone call from the Chief Medical Officer expressing his dissatisfaction that she had prepared and submitted the submission. She apologised and explained that she had been asked to prepare it and submit it by Chris Stewart, and that Dr. Naresh Chadha, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, had provided input and seen the submission prior to it being forwarded to the First and Deputy First Minister. And the next paragraph, please. In fact, the next two paragraphs. Dr. Michael McBride asked for some amendments to be made and asked me to ensure that ministers were provided with the amended version. He advised me that all submissions to the First and Deputy First Minister and Executive should be cleared by him personally and that this should not happen again. She amended the submission and ensured that the updated version, including your comments, were presented to the First and Deputy First Minister. Yeah. And it was after that, we see at paragraph 49, that Dr. Michael McBride emailed asking her to confirm that the submission had been amended, and that is the email that we had just looked at.
Yeah.
Sir Michael, on the 30th of January, you phoned a senior civil servant in the Executive Office in relation to work that she had undertaken, briefing the ministers from the Executive Office about a very important issue of pandemic preparedness. That's what
That is
the statement
correct,
indicates.
yes.
And do you accept that that happened?
Oh, no, I agree that that happened, and I think I addressed that in my answer earlier, that my rationale for that was to ensure that the First Minister and Deputy First Minister were receiving information in a submission that was of professional and technical nature that was absolutely correct. That is a professional responsibility of mine. I think at that time, as I've said earlier, and as I recall, Ms. Rooney explained to me, I hadn't been aware that the advice and input had been provided by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. No. So it was a misunderstanding on my part.
But in fact, Ms. Rooney indicates that your advice to her was that all submissions to the First and Deputy First Minister and the Executive should be cleared by you personally, and that it should not happen again, that anything should go.
I think that, look, I've indicated earlier that I accept the wording in an email. I think that, and the email is there, what I was referring to was my professional and technical advice. This was a rapidly developing situation. It was crucially important, in my view, that the advice of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister accurately and fully reflected the picture. And I've already alluded to the email of the 29th of January, when the references to comments that Professor Sir Chris Whitty made had been misinterpreted and reflected in an email of the 29th of January. So I had a professional responsibility to ensure that professional, and then in the absence of the Chief Scientific Advisor, professional medical and scientific advice was absolutely robust and accurate. I absolutely agree that how that's written can be interpreted differently. It is understood, as I said earlier, I do not clear papers to ministers and other departments. I do not clear papers to the First and Deputy First Minister. But what I would expect to do is clear professional technical advice to inform those papers, and that happened throughout the pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. Ms Manahan, did you have something you wanted to raise? Was there a document?
My lady, it's INQ 000 474 210. And my lady, it's quite convenient. It leads on, Sir Michael, from the question you've just been posed. This question, which was raised before lunch today by Senior Counsel to the Inquiry, about the email from yourself to Ms Rooney about clearing documents. Now, in your response, you explained that, and you've explained again, that you were referring to clearing in a professional and technical advice, and you stated it was crucial, you were confident in respect of the nature of that technical and professional advice. So if we could look actually at that INQ 00047 document, and in particular at paragraph 2 of that document, we should see the track. Are you able to see, Sir Michael, are you able to see the track changes on the document?
Are those my track changes, or?
Yes, okay. It actually doesn't come up on this copy, but we have another copy in which the track changes, and we can see that they're attributed to your personal email account. I was wondering if you could look at the track changes and whether you could consider whether the advice before the addition of your track changes had accurately reflected what had been said at the Cobra meeting.
I do not believe that before the track changes it fully or comprehensively reflected the discussion at Cobra, and I would want to emphasise that is absolutely not a reflection on either Ms Rooney or indeed my Deputy Chief Medical Officer. I was at the meeting and I felt it was absolutely essential that the First Minister and Deputy First Minister had first-hand readout of as CMO, my understanding of what had been said at the meeting and the significance of that, I felt it was also important to emphasise, and again, this point has perhaps been missed as well, that when the WHO declares a pandemic, it doesn't mean that we're going to see the consequences and scale of something that unfolded tragically over the last number of years, and we're still many are still living with the consequences. What it means is that there is a new virus in circulation, that it's spreading globally, but it is neutral in terms of what the potential impact is, because again, at that time, when something's declared a pandemic, you don't wait to see what the impact is. So, for instance, with H1N1, we declared a pandemic. We anticipated a very significant impact and consequence, and that didn't ultimately transpire. It was by comparison to this pandemic. So I think that the additions of those comments, while they may seem to be small, I think are significant contextually.
Yes, can you relate them, therefore, then to the context of the email which you sent covering, given that the significance, as you have outlined, to the changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the final sentence is particularly important, where I indicate the need for governments to increase the level of planning and preparedness. And I think this is the point that I was very keen to signal, and I know we've discussed this earlier in my evidence.
I think we're going to have to leave it there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm afraid, I'm so sorry, Sir Michael.
Sure.
I'm going to have a stenographer downing tools.
All right, apologies.
That's all right. I'm the one that pay the penalty, not you. Okay. Is that sufficient? I've got the point.
Yes.
I appreciate the point you wanted to make was that there were amendments that Sir Michael thought he had to make, given his professional capacity.
Yes. Very much obliged.
And that's really the point that Ms. Burnham was trying to explore. So
I'm glad you understood it, because I sort of...
No, well, don't worry. I've been alerted to it. I had forewarning,
so
right. I knew. Right. So thank you very much for your help, Sir Michael. I appreciate you helped me in Module 1. It was Module 1, wasn't it? I think?
It was Module 1, yeah.
And I may well have to call on you again. I'm not sure yet, but
sure.
And I do understand the demands it makes upon not only you personally, but obviously people with whom you work. So I'm very grateful for your help.
Happy to be assistance, yeah.
Thank you. 10 o'clock Monday morning. I hope people have as good a weekend as they can.